It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. What's up? What's happening? I'm Craig Hoffman. He is Logan Paulsen, and the offseason football portion of the offseason is here, Logan. We finally reached OTAs, no more drafts, no more maybe some more free agency, but the main focus now, what can they do on the field to set themselves up for training camp? By the way, something we'll talk about later in the show is training camp, and specifically the joint practices announced. What are the benefits of those? We will talk about that later in the show. I will say we're recording this on Monday morning. And so if anything comes out of the NFL's owners meetings, we will talk about it. Of course, I will talk about it on the radio, on the Hoffman Show, 4 to 7 on the Team 980, Monday through Friday. And if there's anything that's major, we will talk about it on Wednesday's pod. Not expecting anything, but just an update perhaps on maybe a timeline around the sale. But Logan, we're going to start with OTAs on the field for the Commanders before we get to kind of a larger discussion about the offseason program and how it's evolved over the years, kind of conversation you won't hear anywhere else. But for you, what's the biggest number one headline? Like you walk into the bubble or wherever if they're practicing outside, wherever they're practicing later this week, where do your eyes go immediately?
Yeah, so I think it just depends on who you are in the organization, and what you're looking at. So I think if you're a scout, if you're a position coach, obviously it's like talent development and making sure your guys get conceptually what you're doing, specifically the young guys. Like, is Emmanuel Forbes the guy you thought he was? And I know this is OTAs. It's very early in the process. Like, we've covered the team for a couple of years now, you for a longer time when you're on the beat, obviously. But you want to make sure that guy you spent the first round pick on is doing what they're supposed to do. Like, I remember, Brandon Sheriff is a perfect example. I was here when they drafted him, and I remember in OTAs, you got to see signs that he wasn't quite ready to play tackle. And I think that kind of started laying the foundation for him in his career, saying, well, he's going to be an excellent guard. And so I think that's a big part of right now. I think if you're Eric Bieniemy, like, you're trying to make sure that your installs are sequenced appropriately, that you are coaching it the way you want to coach it, the details there. And this is the foundational piece, right? Through the first little bit of OTAs, they start with day one install, like phase 1 and 2. They start with day one install. They work through, I think, like day 7 or day 8, and they restart the installs. So you really want to make sure that this foundation of knowledge, if you're the offensive coordinator, is super dialed in. So I think it's obviously everyone's got different objectives. I think for me, if I was when I go watch OTA practice, it's going to be, how do the young guys look? I think the defense is going to look really sharp. And then, how does EB look, and how does that offense look, and how does Sam Howell look in the context of the offense? And those are kind of, to me, the big things that they're not definitively answered during OTAs, but the start of that is starting to be answered, I guess, if that makes sense.
From my media seat, here's the two that I want. I'll give you one on each side of the ball. One is, what's the split of the quarterback reps? Sure. Are they getting Sam Howell? And this is just trying to put a finer point on the very obviously correct larger points that you just said, right? But if we're going to try to put a finer point on some things, what's the split of the quarterback reps? Are we having a true quarterback competition? Is this a 70-30 split? Is it a 50-50 split? Is it a 90-10 split with first team starters? How many is Howell getting? How many is Brissett getting? And, there's different ways you can do that, right? You can do 100% Sam Howell one day, 100% Jacoby Brissett the next. Like, you can just have them alternate being QB1. You can split the reps on any given day. You can, what I think they will likely do is split them like 70-30 or maybe even heavier towards Howell every day, unless he all of a sudden doesn't look very good. And then you start working Brissett in a little bit more because you're, hedging your bet that Sam's not going to be the guy when you get to August, and then you need to get Jacoby ready in this offense. Obviously, that's all part of the larger context of how's the offense being installed, how's Bieniemy doing, how is everyone coming along. But to me, like, quarterback is the obvious biggest one because it always is, and how they split those reps is important. I'll let you respond to that real quick, then I'll get to my second one, my defensive one.
Yeah, and I think that's that's important because it's not necessarily are they getting the same number of reps, it's how are they splitting the reps with the one group, which is kind of what you're alluding to there, just to kind of put a finer point on that. And Because I mean, I really do believe, like in my heart of hearts, like having been around for a while and been with veteran quarterbacks, like Jacoby Brissett will probably look better earlier. I think he'll understand the offense better. I think he'll understand kind of what EB is looking for, and will be a little bit easier to coach early on because he's just had more exposure to NFL offenses. So I think he'll look better earlier. And if they really want to give Sam Howell a fair shake, I think they need to be creative with the reps and make sure he's getting enough opportunity to really show he knows what's going on. So I think that is a very compelling part of OTAs. Is it going to be definitively answered in OTAs? Probably not. But I think that it is definitely something that kind of starts to inform a perspective. Like one of the things you notice when you cover a team for a while is that like coaches will say something, and then the thing that is the most supportive of that is how their actions on the field. And again, this is the first time you get to see the guys on the field in a while and get to see kind of how the coaches are executing this vision that they've been articulating. Because let's say, for example, they come out and Jacoby Brissett is taking, 60% of the one reps. I think that informs a perspective. I don't think that's going to happen, but I think that informs a perspective. So this is a really cool opportunity to see that stuff. So.
Yeah, definitely. My second one, my defensive one, if you will, is who shows up on the D line, specifically the edge players. Right. Yeah. Montez Sweat, and that's often the sexiest headline this time of year is like, so and so wants a new contract. Do they show up to the voluntary portion of OTAs? And I think a couple years ago, Jack Del Rio was pretty ticked when a couple of guys didn't show up. Obviously we've seen it last year. Daron Payne. I mean, he showed up, but he didn't do a whole lot.
He just didn't participate. Yeah.
Right. But I do think like that is significantly more important, or like that is a significant upgrade from not showing up at all. Right. Like the gap between that and like, playing is like the playing stuff is kind of extra for a guy like Payne at this stage of his career. And I would say the same for Montez. But to be in the meetings and to be around and to watch your teammates practice and, be able to watch whatever adjustments and coaching points, like dude's had enough physical reps in the NFL at this point. Sure, maximizing to get better, he'd be out there, but he can get, I don't know, you tell me, 70, 80%, 90% of what he needs at this point in the offseason just by being there. These are not exactly full speed reps. So if you're just there in the meetings, like you can get most of what you need to get out of May and June. Chase Young's a little bit different story though. And Chase, for a lot of reasons, from kind of adjusting to the speed of the game, starting at an OTA speed and then eventually a training camp speed, a preseason speed, a full regular season speed. Like he needs to climb that ladder, gaining confidence of taking, obviously not a lot of contact, as Ron Rivera had too much contact last year, and that's why they have 2 less practices this year. But taking some amount of contact and going through football movements when they get into drills and seeing things. And there's also like a leadership element too, right? If he's going to be like, oh yeah, I'm a leader on this football team. Okay, well, you can't lead from California or Denver or wherever else. Like, you kind of got to be there. And so if he's going to proclaim these things as part of his upcoming contract negotiations, there's got to be a bit of show me as well. So I think it's big for both those guys to be there. I think it's huge for Chase to participate. And then for Montez, as long as he's around, like that's good enough for me.
And we're going to talk about this in more detail in a second, but I do think it's important that fans understand, like, this is not the OTAs of 10 years ago or 15 years ago. This is a really different environment, So I do think, to your point, like, how much are they actually getting out of being on the field? Probably not, definitely not as much as it once was. I'll say that. And is that good or bad? We'll talk about that in more detail in a little bit, but I do think for a guy like Payne, for him just to show, or Montez, like Montez in this example, if he's just showing up, he's in meetings, he's doing the walkthroughs, he's doing, the individual. Payne did all the individual last year, and then he would kind of pick days and do some team. He'll do like team run one day and then just kind of shut it down after that. Like, there's a lot of value there. Just being around your teammates, being around the verbiage, being around what the defensive vision is. And so I think that's extremely advantageous. And so I do think, like, as much as people were kind of poo-pooing Payne last year, I do think Payne did the right thing. He came to OTAs, he did the stuff he was supposed to do. And like, quite frankly, I've talked to a couple of my buddies around the league, and like, they don't really care if guys participate in OTAs the same way they used to, right? Before it was like, oh my gosh, you're a bad guy. You don't, it's different now. So I agree. I agree that so I think that's a positive, right? So if Montez comes and is kind of on the sideline with his helmet off for most of it, but he's in the meetings, he's doing this stuff, I think good for Montez, right? If Chase doesn't come, I think if I'm Chase, if I'm his people, if I'm advising him, I kind of agree with you, Craig. I think he should be doing some stuff on the field as kind of a like a sign of good faith, and B, just a good way to kind of get your mind back in football. Because I mean, I think we both can agree, like when we watched him last year, he didn't look comfortable, and it's hard coming off a very serious knee injury to be comfortable. And one of the things that, like when I do a rehab or when I help with a rehab, it's just getting the athlete comfortable. And here is an environment where it's the contact is less, the speed is less, but it is mimicking football activities. And to me, as a rehab person, this is one of the best ways to kind of say, hey man, your knee's fine, right?
100%.
You don't need to take 1,000 reps a day. Take 10, 15 reps a day. Look, man, look at this cut you made. Look at this stutter move you did on the bull, like all that stuff. And so I think it'd be great for him. Obviously, he's going to make his own decision, and it'll be interesting to see what he does. But I do think that's really compelling. And then, in addition to the defensive line, I think one of the things I'm most interested in is how they're going to kind of parcel out the reps in the secondary. Like what is like in this dance of musical chairs, like how does it start at least? Because it doesn't, how it starts isn't as important as how it finishes, but I want to see how they're using Quan. I want to see who the Buffalo nickel is. I want to see how they're using Jamin and the guy from Seattle. What's his name?
The guy that they signed.
Yeah, whatever. Corey. Yeah, but anyway, Cody Barton.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
sorry, Cody. We'll get your name. We promise.
Yeah, but how they allocate that stuff? Who's playing the post? Who's playing the nickel? Because I really think like if that group comes together and is better than kind of the sum of its parts, which I think an addition like Quan Martin allows you to do, like this defense could be scary good, and I think this is the foundational piece for that.
Oh, 100%. If this team's good this year, like obviously Sam will have to play at a certain level, or Jacoby's in. Like the quarterback play can't be subpar. But if this team's like genuinely really good, it's because their defense is top 5.
Right.
And
I think they have the pieces to get that done, like, which is crazy.
Yeah, I agree. No, I 100% agree, especially if Jamin is a lot, starts at the Jamin he ended last year with and grows upon that, even maybe starts ahead of that because he's got another offseason under his belt. If Barton is a good player, obviously the D-line, and Chase is a huge part of that. Like if Chase comes to play as Chase bleeping Young, this defense could be scary. Along those lines, like kind of as a wrap-up point to all those things, to the Chase point, to the secondary point. By the way, who's starting? Is it Forbes? Do they just go ahead and be like, we know that's how it's going to end. Go ahead and put him on the outside. Or do they kind of give the veteran hat tip to Kendall and BSJ and let those guys start on the outside? But in general, like unlike the NBA and basketball, right, or even baseball to an extent, like you can simulate the game pretty easily, right? Baseball, you can get in a cage and simulate live pitching. The hardest thing is like simulating fielding situations. But like baseball is such an individualized sport, you can do the things you need to do. Mm-hmm. Guys play pickup all summer long in the NBA. There's incredible runs in Los Angeles and New York and Miami where like NBA players are playing not NBA caliber basketball, but pretty close to it all summer long in order to get ready for their seasons. You don't simulate football. Like, it's just not a thing. Like, you can do all the individual drills, and like you and I have both worked with NFL players in the off season, like trying to get them ready. You can mimic a lot of movements. You can mimic some conditioning type of situations. You can mimic a lot of stuff, but you can't simulate 11 on 11, what it's like when there's 21 other guys running around you, and you have 11 on 11 periods, and even to 7 on 7 is kind of a stepping stone to that. Or whatever, your 9 on 7s, all that stuff. You have those things in OTAs. And so for a guy like Chase specifically, getting out there and simulating that and not being on bags and cones, I think is an essential step in the rehab process. So I think that actually transitions nicely to what we're going to talk about next. But to me, like, that's why it's, Chase and Montez, for instance, are in different ones, and why for the defensive backs, like getting these reps in and trying the different combinations now is essential, because you've just got to try as much as you can in these extremely limited reps and give yourselves as coaches as much information as possible to decide, whether it's a contract situation like Chase or who's going to be on the field in the defensive back situation.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you brought that up, because to me, when you're training for football, it's more similar to MMA than it is to like another field sport. And what I mean by that is, like, you can't get out there and spar all the time. You just can't do it, right? So you got to kind of be creative in the off season about, ramping intensities, working different stuff. And I train Morgan Moses, kind of help him out in the off season because he lives in the area still. And we do a lot of, special strength exercises for offensive line. And it's a position on the field that really relies on that. And I was talking to Mo, and he's like, man, I really love how this gets me in a good spot. But ultimately, like, I go to OTAs to like fine tune the mechanism, right? Because you're lined up across from other guys. So it's like, am I oversetting? Like, how do I have to sit on my punch? And it's just, you can't, as much as you try to mimic that, it's always going to be kind of low definition compared to the high definition of even OTAs. So I do think that, like, to your point, it's like, while this is not what it once was, OTAs, it's still an important part of just kind of getting guys ready for training camp, getting them ready for this season. And so, yeah, I totally agree with that.
Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. That's Logan Paulson, played 10 years in the NFL. I'm Craig Hoffman, covered the Commanders for 5 years on the beat, now host a daily radio show on the Team 980, if you don't know. And if you're new to the podcast, you might not also know that Logan and I also, in our spare time, so much free time that we both have, our strength coaches. So Logan, started that pursuit at the end of his playing career and has continued that at a high level. I've been training people for almost 8 years now, of all different stripes, all different levels. But we kind of wanted to bring that side of our brains to discussion about OTAs, Logan. And you called me a little bit before we started recording here and pitched this idea, and I love it because I think it's pretty fascinating how OTAs in the offseason has evolved over the years. And the idea was you take out contact, you reduce injuries, and the results are mixed depending on who you ask. And
Right.
There's been different years and the types of injuries change and all that stuff. But generally speaking, I know you've been having some conversations with folks around the league, and they think, overall their injury rates are down. And that means mission accomplished. But
Right.
what are the pros and cons of how the offseason has changed? And then we can get into some of the best practices and ways to make sure that guys are ready mentally and physically for the season under the new rules.
Yeah, so I think it's important to just kind of understand what it was. Like when I first got in the league, like, it's 2010. This was old CPA. It was 1 year under the old CPA, and Mike Shanahan was the head coach. And he did a good job of taking care of you. But taking care of you under old CBA, this is what it looked like. For our rookie minicamp, right, we came in and we had a practice at 4:30, like basically right when the sun peaked up over the trees. The rookies would be on the field, and we'd have a 2-hour practice. Boom, right there,
Oh.
against each other, against all the rookies, right? So you can't do team, you can do a little 7-on-7, right? You can do like 9-on-7, which are kind of different, drills where you're, 9-on-7's a blocking drill, 7-on-7's a throwing drill, but you're not using all 11 guys, right? And we do that for like an hour and a half, 2 hours. We'd come in, we'd have breakfast, and we'd go to meetings. We'd meet for a couple hours, and then we'd come back out for practice with the team. And obviously, as rookies, we didn't get as many reps in that practice, but we were on the field. We did an individual. And, I'd get 10 reps in that practice, which is pretty good. It's not an insignificant amount. We'd go back in, we'd have lunch, we'd meet again, and then we'd have a walkthrough. And a lot of teams would treat that as a second practice. And walkthrough under Mike was basically he called it a full speed walkthrough. So, like, you would sprint, you would block, you just didn't have your helmet on, and everyone kind of worked at different tempo. But it was like a 2-hour activity. And so that's what old OTAs used to be, right? They could basically do whatever they wanted. And if you juxtapose that to now, which is kind of like you get there at 8 and you have 6 hours in the building. So you have meetings in the morning, you have a practice, which is very highly governed by the NFLPA. We just talked about how Ron lost sessions. And then you have a kind of a conclusion meeting, and then you're out of the building. You're out of the building at like 2. I compare that to what I did as a rookie, which is you're in at like approximately 5 a.m. and then you're leaving at like 7. Like that's in the off season. So very, very different. And a lot of people, I think, like it depends on who you talk to. You talk to agents, right? I think a lot of agents with guys who have young players in the NFL, they get a little bit worried because it's like, it makes it really, you don't have the same rep volume to develop young talent, right? And I understand that. But as an older guy, and you mentioned I've talked to a couple of people around the league, like strength coaches, and they mentioned that despite this drastic decrease in offseason prep, their injury rates have gone down a little bit going into the season and through the season. And I think one of the things I wanted to bring up with you, Craig, is that training volume, in my opinion, is one of the highest indicators or highest risk factors for injury, right? And so have they just done a good job of saying, don't go crazy with the training volume in the offseason, letting the athlete recover, and then here's your 18-week period where you're really going to get banged up, and then we have a longer offseason period to recover. Because, like George Kittle said this, LaDainian Tomlin said this, like every week it's like getting in a car crash. And I can attest to that. It's just like you come out of that game feeling like you've never felt before in a bad way. And is that stress of season so high that you need the full offseason to kind of be relatively chill to make sure you're fully recovered? And right now, the early return on investment, because this is a relatively new process, is that the injury rates are slightly lower. So again, like I know people freak out about this, but it might be benefiting the players long term.
Yeah, this will stun you, Logan, but I have a lot of thoughts. I will try to
That's why we're doing it. Thoughts.
Yeah, make them one at a time so we can kind of go through it. Okay, let me ask you this first to make sure I'm not just throwing numbers at the wall here. If the season is a 10, right, in terms of intensity, your RPE, your rate of perceived exertion is 10. What was the Shanahan days OTA like?
So for me, as a rookie trying to make the team, and I know people say this, and I'm not being hyperbolic here. My agent was like, treat every single day like a game, and you better believe I did. So it was full contact. Like I was trying to finish guys. I was going as hard as I could. And you can ask any defensive guy that I played with. I was a psycho. I might have been a little bit of an outlier there, but I was ramped like that in practice. Now the game is a little bit higher. The crowd's there. The opponent's there.
The adrenaline. So let's say it was a 9.
Yeah, like I was like maybe 8.5, 8, something like that. Like I was pushing it though for sure.
So let's say the average guy it's an 8 under the old system, 7.5, 8, somewhere in there, right? And the current one is a 5, a 4,
6,
somewhere
5,
in there,
6,
4 to 6, depending on who you are. If you're Trent Williams, it's probably like a 2.
Yeah.
But that's the benefit of being Trent Williams, right? So I think if you realize that that's the scale of intensity, there is something to the entire offseason to recover.
Yeah.
I think there's probably more to it, though, that if you try to take that recovery seriously from January, February, March, depending on when your season ended, for some folks, it's just February, March. And then April, you're kind of starting to get back on the field a little bit. And then by May, it's there. Did you really ramp up properly?
That's a great point.
To May, right? And that's essentially what we're going to wind up talking about here is kind of that ramp period. And I referenced it earlier with Chase. If Chase can work at a 6 now, 7 in 7.5 in training camp, 8 to 8.5 in preseason, and then he's ready to go. First couple of weeks, maybe he's only still performing at a 9, but he's just getting adjusted first couple of weeks of the season, and then he's humming at 10 by week 3. That's good. And by the way, Chase Young at a 9, if he's Chase Young, is a pretty really ridiculously good football player. But if you are at a 1 and a 2, because you need to recover from the season, you need to rebuild. We typically put our athletes through a phase 0 and when they come out of the season, right? Meaning that you are doing strict recovery and kind of restorative exercises. You're doing a lot of corrective exercises coming out of the season because you've been banged up. You've been dealing with pain, and maybe your squat pattern is off because you've been compensating for an ankle that doesn't feel very good and thus isn't as mobile as it was or as we'd like it. So we give you a couple weeks of deload. We really work on that ankle mobility. We let that ankle heal. And then you start to build back up into phase 1, that base building, phase 2, trying to put some muscle back on, phase 3, starting to turn that muscle into strength and power and on up the list until you get to your final like phase 6, which is explosiveness, right? That's kind of how the train with the best Onyx Elite method that Chris Gora is my co-host on the Train with the Best podcast, who is like Lorenzo Alexander's trainer, for instance.
Right.
Randall Cobb worked with him. He's worked with Kerrigan. He's worked with a bunch of guys over the years. Like that's how he would phase out an off season is really at 7 phases because 0 through 6, but that's kind of how that would go. And if you're only at phase 3 by May, and all of a sudden you're asking your body to perform at 10 or an 8.5 or 9, then you're probably going to get hurt in OTAs. It's not necessarily getting hurt during the season. It's like there are just less reps available where you are asking your body to do something it's not capable of. And by the way, more full speed, high impact collisions in May that guys are getting hurt on. And so if you take those away, there's just less chances to get hurt. You're not asking your body to do things it's not capable of yet because you're not at that phase of training. And by the time you get to August, where we really want to peak, like we always tried to get, or Chris, I should say, always try to get Lorenzo like in, it wasn't necessarily ready for the season, but ready for preseason by the time he went to training camp.
Right.
And so if you have the time to do that and periodize it out properly, I think you're just going to see a ton less injuries. And that's kind of the physical side of it. And then there's a mental side I want to talk about as well, but we can get there in a second.
Yeah, let me just elaborate on that. So like I think so something that I would notice is that so when training camp was really hard, like I'm talking just training camp, like
right.
So
Back in the 2-a-days, like all that kind of stuff.
So this is like old CBA. I wasn't like physically right. This is not an exaggeration. So probably like week 4 or 5, excuse me. So like I was so beat up from training camp that I was in like, I would say this like higher environment of like injury risk for like 4 or 5 weeks. Because training camp, I mean, listeners who played high school football or played college, like the 2-a-days were no joke. And imagine taking that with like the alphas of the alphas for 2-a-days in the NFL and just beating the ever-loving crap out of each other for 4 weeks. Like you came out of that just totally broken down. And the offseason was kind of the same way. And they gave you this like month before season. And like, think about it. We were doing like a 10-week, something like, was it 10 weeks, 11 weeks off season of just ramping, and then you get a month off. And I hate to break it to you, that's not enough time to recover from like, the sprained elbow, the messed up knee, the ankle, the shoulder, then go right into the training camp, then go right into season. So like, I do think like in retrospect, thinking back on it, that the training volumes accrued in the off season and training volume here were, obviously there's the weight room, but there's also, the practice that's a training stimulus. And so so we were actually going like, if you really thought about it, like it was almost like year round of like pretty heavy hitting in the off season. And something that I noticed when I got in I think it was year 4 or 5, like my off season, I couldn't lift the same way I wanted to. Like, and I was like, what's wrong with me? Like, I'm not pushing hard enough. And I think it was just accumulated fatigue, quite honestly, from 4 years of playing NFL football. And I never letting the elbow heal or never letting the wrist heal, never letting the neck get right, whatever it was. And so I do think that this period of kind of like, let's put the brakes on the offseason while old heads, like when this first happened, I hated this, Craig. I thought this was the dumbest thing ever because it's like, how am I going to get better? But in reality, like when I kind of step back and take a look at it, I'm like, it actually is probably better like longitudinally for guys because like it keeps you fresher, And I think the other thing that I wanted to bring up is like before old CBA, like you could lift weights like pretty much the whole offseason with the club, right? You could be here the whole time lifting weights. And now they've really limited that to about, I think it's 6 weeks now, 5 weeks, something like that. And and I know, and now the listeners hopefully will know, that is not enough time to cultivate a longitudinal adaptation, right? A normal training block is like 12 to 14 weeks, approximately.
Depending on what the adaptation,
right. About. And so to get 6 weeks, like your muscles will adapt, but your tendons aren't quite there. So like, why am I going to take this 6 weeks and then go into this heavy football? It's okay to kind of, like you said, slowly ramp up. So I think fans, they think, oh, this is soft, this is blah, blah, blah. But I do think that it is the appropriate ramping. We talked about MMA, right? We were putting gloves on with no headgear and straight throwing punches at each other. Old CBA, like that's what we were doing. Yeah. And now this is a little bit more of a of a build, a slow burn to that fire that is the season.
Right. And you need that time to build up that muscle adaptation and rebuild. I mean, that's the other thing too, is like you lose weight during the season, like you lose strength, you lose power. I will say one of the things that was super impressive that I saw during my time is guys who were able to peak at the end of the season. Like Josh Norman, say what you want about how he played when he was here, but that dude was available. And I'm trying to remember what year. It might have been his last year here, honestly. Day after the season, he PR'd his like bench press. And you're just like, he took care of his body. He took his lifting seriously. Like he periodized in his mind, obviously they didn't make the playoffs, but in his mind, he's like, I'm going to peak for the playoffs. And that's the level of detail that, I think players should be thinking about this stuff with and strength coaches and try to, but there are so many limitations. It's really hard. I will say this though, the single biggest factor in injury reduction is mental processing. If you get yourself caught in bad positions, you're going to get hurt. And that's across sports, right?
Sure.
Non-contact injuries, things like that. Or in the case of the NFL, like you make a mental mistake, get caught the wrong way, get blindsided, or you get yourself cut block, or you're not aware of someone diving at your legs. Like those kinds of things happen because you're not mentally in it. And that's why a guy like a Trent Williams can go at a 1 or 2 in the preseason. Like he's able to just see the game, think the game so much better and be ready. But it's why, for instance, in the NBA, like LeBron James may be the smartest player to ever play the game. He has largely been healthy over a 20-year career. And some of his injuries that he has had have been bad luck. Like he slipped on a wet spot on a floor. There was nothing he could do about that. He just caught bad luck and strained his adductor. Like those types of things are going to happen. But the best players are the best players because they are the smartest players, and they typically are available because they are the smartest players. And I think that gets into a really interesting question about OTAs and injury prevention, because part of what you're trying to do during OTAs is get your guys ready for the season mentally.
Sure.
Do you do the decision? Do they know the plays? Do they know the routes? Do they know, are their bodies prepared to make the cuts and do all the things they need to do and do them on balance in good body position? So one, that obviously goes to, do you work with, whether it's a private trainer or does your strength staff train cutting, train, the mechanics of movement, stuff that you do exceptionally well in your training with a guy like Morgan. People that follow you on Instagram have seen the videos of making sure that Morgan's in a good body position for that punch, all those kinds of things. But it's also, do you train decision making? We use a product called Blaze Pods, right? And people have probably seen these in various things. If you watch like Drive to Survive, the Formula One show on Netflix, a lot of them use this for warm-ups, right? And it's just a light series of like reactive type of stuff. And whether it's using a tool like that, or just simply like, if I say 1, go right, if I say 2, go left, or make it odds and evens, you make it colors and fruits. Like if I scream out banana, like you're going to go right, if and using things like that to practice for an option route for receivers, right? Those individual decision making and training the decision making and reactive type of things, and the more game like you can make it, is going to make your athletes more resilient to injury because they're prepared to move like they will in the game. And that, to me, is the biggest question about OTAs and the lack of intensity, is how much are you actually simulating game movements so that players are ready for game situations? And I think finding the right balance between training volume and mental preparedness is the sweet spot for the NFL. And that's one where I wonder if they've gotten it quite right, or is there still tweaking to do?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think, like, for example, and I think we talked about this on the phone when I called you earlier, like, so one of the reasons they adopted this model is because like rugby leagues in the UK adopted a similar model. Like you couldn't tackle, I forget the exact rule, but you couldn't tackle someone without a bag in a rugby practice for like a certain amount of time in the off season. And so they did that, and that was fine. But what they noticed is that there was a big increase in guys breaking their arms. Right? Because like in a rugby tackle, like you got to kind of get in there in a specific way, and guys would get like a knee to the bicep, and they'd break their upper arm, break their humerus or whatever. And so that was a big thing for a while, right? And then they had to kind of change their off-season approach. They said, oh, well, we can kind of, it was no tackling. That was it. They weren't allowed to tackle. Then they had this whole industry develop around rugby of like developing tackling traits in the off-season while not actually hitting a person. And I think that you're kind of walking this line, and you keep referencing Trent Williams, which I think is excellent. But for a guy like Trent Williams, the offseason skill acquisition is not that important to him because this is what his 13th year in the NFL. Like he has seen everything, he's done everything.
Correct. Exactly.
He's got it all in the CPU. I think it's more important for younger guys, right? And I think,
and that's what I was saying, right? Trent can go at a 1 or 2 intensity because he doesn't need the reps. Guys, and a slow speed rep for Trent is good enough to keep it fresh. Versus like, can you make that decision at NFL speed if you are someone who's never seen NFL speed because you're a rookie?
Absolutely. And I think so that's a huge thing. And then when we say there's been an injury reduction, like when you talk to these strength coaches, one of the things that they are so concerned with soft tissue injuries, right? And that makes sense. Volume's way down, the body's not as stressed, you're following kind of a nice progression into the season, these high intensity things, right? So that makes sense. But my question is like, what are the numbers specifically with regards to ACL or concussion, right? Because like one of the things about, off-season work earlier is that I always felt like I knew exactly where my head needed to go to not get super dinged, right? Because we were getting like full speed reps in practice. I'm talking just blocking even, right? So as a tackler, like I'm sure there's some carryover there. And then ACL injury, you mentioned that kind of reactive element. Like that's where you get a little bit dicey. You get your feet, your rhythm and timing isn't lined up. So it'd be interesting to say like this. It's easy to say there's been a reduction in injury because A, I'm sure there has been. B, you're not practicing as much, so there's going to be a natural reduction in injury anyway. But like, how does it affect some of those other bigger activities, bigger injuries more specifically with regards to the offseason because of some of that kind of neurocognitive stuff that you're doing to kind of get in the right positions and things like that. So I do think it's interesting, and I'm not sure they've got it figured out exactly just yet, the NFL, the NFLPA. But, I think when you kind of take a 1,000-foot view and take some of these statistics that these teams are offering, the old heads that are like, man, this is too soft, I think, it is benefiting the players, at least on this kind of 1,000-foot view of the information that's available.
Yeah. And then the last thing I'll add too is like coaches have to adjust too. If you're like, I need 12 weeks to install my offense, sorry, you don't get it.
Yeah.
How effective can you be in 6 weeks? Like you have to make decisions as a coach of what to prioritize and what's important. And I'd rather have, pared down something executed extremely well than a 12 weeks worth of offense executed like crap because we could only have 6 weeks to install it. Like,
and I think
that's super important.
The other thing, I'm glad you brought that up because it also applies to coaching. And I think it does value, obviously install. It's clear because you can't have 12 days of install because you only have 9 practices, right? So do you mush them together, whatever. But also, like, I've got agents telling me, man, I really want my offensive lineman to go to Cleveland. And I'm like, why would you possibly want that? It's because Bill Callahan's there, and he's developed a system of developing offensive tackles given the shorter time constraints, right? He has this really specific methodology for getting these guys ready to play football seasons and getting them technically ready, getting them mentally ready. And I think that becomes more valuable in this new CBA. Like, how do you program as a position coach, which is something that you didn't have to do, to get the guys ready for the demands of season, given the restrictions placed on you, right? So if you watch anything Bill Callahan does, there's all these bands and bags and sandbags to help the body of the offensive lineman kind of get used to those big force numbers without actually going against another person. And I think he's done an excellent job of that. So I think you're going to see some cool innovation, from offensive coordinators, from position coaches to get guys ready. And I think it becomes the positions that require more contact, it becomes more complicated. But for receivers, for example, and I think this is maybe one of the reasons you see receiver play at an all-time high in the NFL is because you can go out and run routes every day, right? You can go out and do that almost every single day. It's the D-line, the offensive line, the linebackers, the tight ends, where you've seen a little bit of a degradation in terms of overall skill when it comes to blocking, taking on blocks, because you don't get to do it as much. And the teams that are really good, the Callahans, for example, that have a methodology to get those guys there, become more and more valuable. So I think that's also kind of an interesting point of this offseason thing.
Yeah, one thing I'll say about Bill though, because people that
he's a psycho, no doubt.
well, I would say because people that that remember me covering Bill would be like, Craig, didn't you say some stuff about this?
Yeah.
I think the methods he uses to get them ready are great. I think he doesn't understand that eventually they're ready and you need to stop.
Yeah, I think
And
he's
that
gotten
was
better at
an
that.
issue, I would imagine.
Yeah, because like, like I remember talking to Sheriff, then this is 100% to your point, is, he was taking, gosh, it was like something like 400 reps during training camp, which is a 3-week period, in addition to all the special strength stuff that he was doing on the field with them. So he gets them out
Right.
30 minutes beforehand. They stay 15
Correct.
minutes later. And we just talked about how like the number one indicator for injury, when it comes to programming is training volume. And you just keep pouring more volume onto these guys and you're going to have injuries. And I think it's not a coincidence that while he was here, Mo had a lot of injuries, Laval had a lot of injuries, Sheriff had a lot of injuries. So
yeah,
I think it's and again, but then you go to Matzkow, and Matzkow's kind of this veteran coach who didn't have like this methodology for developing young players. So I do think you need to kind of reside in a little bit of both worlds, like knowing that my guy is now Trent Williams, a 13-year vet. He doesn't need to be doing this crazy band work at the same volume as the guy that just came in, right? So
exactly correct. And also it's different in week 3 versus week 15,
100%.
right?
Yep.
And I will close out this segment with a little soccer sprinkle here, because I think soccer does an incredible job, the strength coach and kind of the culture of how strength coaching is in soccer. They try to keep their entire team at similar volumes at all times.
Mm.
So if you go to a professional soccer game and the final whistle blows, you will likely see players that came on as substitutes and the ones that didn't go and run after the game. And what they are trying to do is, it's not like, obviously you can't go simulate playing 90 minutes, but they have GPS data on all the players and they realize kind of how much high speed running and pure sprinting is done. They've come up with tests to say like, okay, you need to cover X amount of yards in X amount of seconds in order to replicate that. We know that the average player at this position does 9 60-yard sprints during a game. So after the game, let's say that position, and I'm making up these numbers, right? But let's say it's a midfielder does 9 60-yard sprints during a game. Afterwards, they will take their midfielders and say, you have 9 60-yard sprints. If someone came on as a substitute and did 4 of them during the game, which they have the GPS tracking data to tell, then that player will do the first 5 and then they'll go walk off and start signing autographs for the fans. Like that kind of equity and equality over the course of your roster to understand this is where every player is at versus putting every player through the same exact thing is what actually works. Yeah. Because then, if Trent Williams gets or Brandon Sheriff gets 100 reps in practice, that's 100 reps you need to take off them in the post-practice stuff.
Right.
Like you don't, or like, hey man, you're good. You're done for today. And I don't know, there's so much different data in football that would be like, okay, are we talking about like 20 mini little shuffles of your feet for an offensive lineman? No, like there's not the same like sprint level data, but there should be some like parallel, whether it's anecdotal or like hard data based off the chips and the GPS and all that kind of stuff that is available to coaches, that a good position coach and strength staff collaborating under a head coach should be able to do to maximize performance and minimize injury risk and kind of keep everybody all at the same level at all times so that the players are ready if they're called upon and not overworked for when they're the starter.
Yeah. And I think, obviously culture has a long history of like matching GPS data. And I think coaches in the NFL are getting more aware of how important that is, but it is a slow process. Like there's been a long-standing history with rugby, with soccer, using the GPS data overseas, and football, again, probably because of some of the limitations you've described. You really have 3 different types of athletes on the field. You've got these sprinters, right. You've got these big guys, you've got these mid guys. The volumes for each one of them, they can't be the same, right? Because you can't run, the O-line can't run with the receivers, and the receivers can't block with the O-linemen, right? So that finding that kind of like middle way, I think has been really interesting. And when you go to the combine and you talk to coaches, position coaches, strength coaches. Like, this is a huge point of conversation about what is the right way to get it done. And everyone's got their own thing. And the other thing is, you're all doing this in an effort to mitigate injury risk. But the problem is, you're playing a contact sport, so you can't mitigate
Of course.
those injuries. So like, it's again, if you're a listener and you have an idea about this, you can make billions of dollars if you have the right approach to this. Leave us a message. We'll take credit for it. No, I'm just kidding.
But we'll help you get it to the right people and share some of the money.
But yeah, so I think that's something just to kind of keep in mind with the whole off season, whole in season data monitor. We can talk about that more later when season gets around. But just to kind of give an overview of the OTA process and how it's changed and how it might be beneficial to players.
Yeah, and like, for example, I remember at the end of training camp practices, sometimes they would put everybody on the line, and you have to run. The only difference is O-line wouldn't run as far as the mid guys, and then the skill position guys had to run the farthest, right?
Yeah.
Like, to
And
me, it's
changed.
like, okay,
everyone used to be the same,
right?
back in the day.
And that. Yeah, so you have that. Okay, that's progress of like, okay, the O-linemen don't need to run quite as far. That's probably dangerous. You don't need anyone pulling a hamstring. But it's also like, it's kind of pointless. Like, that's not really conditioning. Like,
Right.
that in no way is that preparing you for football.
Right.
But what you can do is have fun with it, right? Let's take the guys who need the extra conditioning because they didn't get as many reps during practice, not because they're out of shape, right? Because they didn't get the extra reps in practice. And let's play a game of red light, green light.
Yeah.
At the end of practice, right? And that way it's competitive. You're working on reaction times. You're working on stopping and starting. And like, I'd rather play a game of red light, green light to simulate like, oh, well, this is getting us ready for 2-minute drill than I would, all right, everybody on the line. You got 15 seconds to run to your spot. Whistle. Like, that's pointless.
Yeah.
That's not good. Red light, green light, that's fun. And by the way, your guys are also probably going to enjoy it a lot more, and like, having fun is kind of important too during the dog days of training camp where everyone is miserable because it's 100 degrees out and you're hitting each other and hitting the same dudes every single day.
I agree, absolutely.
Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. I'm Craig Hoffman. He is Logan Paulson. Announced last week for the Commanders that they will do a couple of joint practices with the Baltimore Ravens ahead of their preseason game. That's the Monday Night Football game, or I don't even know if it's on a Monday night, but it's the ESPN game.
Yeah,
of course, Logan. Yeah, of course, Logan and B. Mitch and Chick will be on the call.
We don't get to be on the call because it's a national.
I was going to say for the other two games.
Yes, for the other games.
Monday, 8 o'clock. I think that's August 21st off the top of my head. Thank you, Nick, for the note. But the joint practice is, Logan, were you a part of any of them during your career, and why are they so beneficial? Because I certainly have my theories, but I was never a part of one outside of watching Trent Williams nearly kill a guy against the Jets and making sure that I got out of the way before that happened.
Yeah, I hated joint practices as a player. I absolutely despised them because, like, we talked about how you're kind of always, or I was always operating in like this 8, 9, 10 range, even in off season. I was always stressed out, always worried about whether I was going to make the team. And here was this thing where they're adding like a game environment, and it's even more stressful because you don't always know the tempo, you don't always know what people are looking for. And so I think that was something that I hated. I absolutely hated it. But being on this side of the microphone, this side of the veil, evaluating guys, in the draft, evaluating free agents, things like that, this is an invaluable piece of seeing like where your team is at. And this used to be kind of what preseason was for, but people are so worried about guys getting hurt in preseason. Now they have these joint practices, which allow you to say, hey, we're going to work red zone concepts against another team. We're going to work third down concepts against another team, 2-minute, 4-minute, first and second down, and kind of see where our offense is at and see how our personnel line up against another team. And so I think that, even though as a player, I couldn't have hated anything more, as a coach, as a scout, as a front office person, these are really, really valuable pieces to kind of say, this is actually where our team is at. And if you think about the last couple of years, Kimes brought this up on his show. I've talked about this with him a couple of times just on the phone. And, like, one of the reasons they start slow is oftentimes guys are kind of in misrepresented roles. And I think a big part of that misrepresented role is that you didn't flush out your evaluation, right? And again, the preseason games are totally different. You got guys like the Rams, for example, who don't play any of their starters. So you're going to look great against those guys. But now in this joint practice context, like I get to practice against Lamar. I get to see what that looks like. I get to, go against a true starting right and left tackle of Baltimore and go against a very good defense and say, oh, okay, this is a problem. If they bring this 3-week pressure, like how do we handle that? And you can kind of get all that evaluation fleshed out. So I think it's an excellent move. It's going to be annoying for the players. It's probably going to be annoying for the coaches on some level because they got to go out to Baltimore and have a couple days away from the family. But from a team building, roster building standpoint, very, very valuable piece.
I think it's a pretty essential part of getting ready for a season. If I was a coach, I would try to do it literally every year.
Yep.
I would also try to do it early-ish because I think the biggest downside of joint practices is there's always fights. And part of that is going back to what we just kind of talked about, where at the end of, it's like 3 weeks of OTAs, 4 weeks of OTAs, you've just kept hitting the same dudes and you're kind of getting sick of practice. It's 100 degrees. And that's how it used to be down in Richmond. Obviously, it's only 95 here, although it's pretty swampy in Ashburn.
Yeah.
So like you're just beaten down and cranky, and you're sitting in meetings all day and 2-a-day practice. Even if it's one's a walkthrough, it's like, do I really want to be outside at 4 p.m. in the sun walking through in a bucket hat? Like, everything's annoying at that stage. And so you finally get a chance to hit someone that's not in another jersey. You finally get a chance to take that out a little bit, and inevitably someone says something, someone hits a little too hard, someone does something, and there's a massive brawl. And it happens almost every joint practice session. And so I would try to do it a little earlier if I was a coach. I'd also try to make sure the practice is structured so that it peaks towards the end and we don't have too much chirping and too many opportunities for things to go sideways early. And because what always happens is you wind up getting a day and a half of practice at best. Right. You end that practice and it's just like, all right, we're done because a bunch of dudes are ready to kill each other. And there was just a big brawl and we can't possibly think about starting again. By the way, ask Mo what he did to a Gatorade machine next time you see him after the Jets joint practice.
What did he do to the Gatorade machine?
I think you should just ask Mo.
I'll ask Mo about when I see him.
Yeah, and see what he tells you, and then you can report back on the pod. But like that to me is the only concern. Outside of that, it's a chance to see different looks. It's a chance to see different schemes. It's a chance to evaluate your players against not your own, which can, sometimes it's like, wow, our defense looks great. It's like, oh, crap, our defense actually wasn't great. Our offense was terrible.
Right.
That was kind of the 2019 team. And so you just have these thoughts of like, this is who we are, and you don't have a measuring stick. I don't understand why you wouldn't want that measuring stick every year as a nice reality check for you, and especially if you can come up with a system that ultimately limits the big downside, which is the brouhaha that inevitably happens at the end of every joint practice session.
Yeah, and I really think it's going to test your coach's leadership. I did 2 or 3 joint practices at my time, and I got in big, huge brawls in 2 of them, and then in the one where we had against New England, there was not even a hint of a fight. And I think because Bill Belichick was just governing that thing with an iron fist, and I think. No offense to Jay, I like Jay a lot, but when we had a joint practice against Houston, Bill O'Brien is the head coach for the other team, and he's like, it was on Hard Knocks, so each day it was like, oh, they beat us on the first day. That was Jay saying us. So then guys are like, okay, we got to go out and practice harder, and then we beat them on the second day, and then he's like, well, we're not having guys who are out here, Bill O'Brien, who are going to look like this on film. So guys don't want to get embarrassed, and all of a sudden it went from kind of this mutual helping each other out, which is a tough practice anyway, to now it is a game and there is no regulation here from like officials or anything like that. And inevitably there's going to be a fight. So I do think understanding from the coach's standpoint, like quite frankly, like early, late, like there's going to be a fight if the coaches aren't on the same page with the practice tempo and they aren't fostering an environment where it's like, hey, that's nonsense. Like, for example, and against New England, like, Belichick got up in front of the team and was like, if anyone gets in a fight, you will not practice for the rest of the week. And that is a huge, huge thing, especially for a guy like me who's trying to make the team. If I don't practice for the rest of the week, like,
You're getting cut.
I'm getting cut. Right. Exactly. So it's like, well, I better be smart about how I'm handling this. And when the guy pushes me after the whistle, like I can't push him back because I got to be here for the next 5 days. So I think establishing those types of rules are even more important than like where it is in the training camp hierarchy. Because like you said, it's annoying, but joint practices are annoying regardless, and guys are just up. It's like this, and it's ultimate competitive guys in a very competitive environment. No one wants to look bad. So how do coaches handle it? How do position coaches handle it? How does team leadership handle it? And again, like there's value there too, because it shows you what kind of leadership you have on your squad and what kind of team you are. But it's
Yeah.
very hard not to get in a fight in these situations.
Hard Knocks last year, Dan Campbell and Frank Reich talked about that before their joint practices with the Colts and Lions. And they, if I'm remembering correctly, I don't think they had anything. There was maybe like one shoving thing, but like there wasn't the giant fracas a la the Houston thing with, D-Hop and D-Hall and, all that happened. The Jets thing was a melee in 20, whatever that was. That was nuts.
Yeah.
And so, Jay was not, that was not one of Jay's strengths. That was for sure. But I do think someone like Ron and Harbaugh, I don't anticipate any problems with that crew.
We'll see.
You
got to handle it well. You got to handle it well. And, I could see it's tough because if one coach comes at it and says something different to their team, like, hey, we want to win the practice, and then the other coach comes back and says, oh, we lost the practice, like just that wording, that relationship with the players, because no one wants to look bad. So you're going to come out and it's going to be a full speed practice. Someone's going to tackle someone to the ground. Someone's going to finish a block, and then everyone is heated because no one wants to look bad. And it's going to be a 300 battle. You know what I mean? Everyone's just going to charge across the field at each other, and like it's Braveheart or something. So
yeah, I will say that 20 whatever it was, where against the Jets, like the brawl was fairly close. I mean, that one was scary because like remember how it was in Richmond, right? Where like you had the fans up on kind of going up on the hill, and we as media sat kind of between the on the inside of the rope between the field and the fans, and that thing started like right in front of us, and all of us were like, "Get the hell out of Dodge!" Which was also hilarious because then you had the PR staff yelling at us to not film it, and all the fans were allowed to film it, and I was just like, "This is dumb." But like my first concern was, and I remember literally thinking this, Trent Williams is punching people. I need to get out of the way and make sure that I don't accidentally get hit here. But getting out of the way, and then that one was super scary because once we were out of the way, it just kept spilling over and like almost went into the stands / might have gone into the stands. And that's obviously incredibly scary. And from a PR perspective, not what you want to showcase. Hey, come watch our practice where we all get in a 300 style battle royale. But hopefully it's successful, and like we said, there's a huge amount of upside to it.
But this is the drawback is that you get 1 day of practice or 1.5 days of practice. So.
Yeah, but I mean the good thing for the Commanders is they get those kind of enhanced practices after they missed 2 during OTAs. If we hadn't mentioned that, I think we did mention it earlier in the show because of the over contact last year. Commanders stripped to some OTA practices, so getting those joint practices, they're not bonus practices, but they are probably better quality practices. And they feel even more important this year. All right, we will have more on OTAs and everything on Wednesday as they'll be getting ready to get started. So we will see you then. In the meantime, make sure that you are subscribed wherever you're watching or listening right now, especially if you're watching on YouTube or you like to consume YouTube content. Also, go subscribe to the Team 980's YouTube page. We stream the Hoffman Show there each and every day from 4 to 7 p.m. So, check that out. We'll see you on the radio. See you back here on the podcast later in the week. For Logan, I'm Craig. Thanks for listening or watching to Take Command. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command. First, why don't you like it? It lets other people know that it was good, and then they should watch it too. And Logan, we have a new exclusive home for full episodes.
We do. 1067 The Fans YouTube page. Go check it out and please subscribe.
Yeah, do what Logan said.
Do it.
Very, very smart.